Hello everyone, my name is Laurenson and I'm studying for an English MA at the University of Worcester. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, which is titled A Tale of Two Johns, Access and Trespass according to John Clare and John Major. John Clare was a 19th century working class poet. He was an amateur botanist and ornithologist, and he owned over 400 natural history books in his own collection. And because of that, he was an environmental humanist 180 years before that term even existed. And John Major became Prime Minister for the UK in 1990, and he was Prime Minister until 1997, first elected as a Member of Parliament for Huntingdon in 1979, the same year that Thatcher came in. John Major and John Clare are united, at least geographically. Here the first map is the Soak of Peterborough. The second map highlights Huntingdonshire, and both the Soak of Peterborough and Huntingdonshire each form a part of modern-day Cambridgeshire. And that green X marks the village of Helpston, where John Clare was born in 1793 and spent the first 39 years of his life. And there is Huntingdon, just down the road from Helpston. And as I've said, John Major became the MP for Huntingdon in 1979. Now I'll come back to John Clare and John Major in a moment. I just want to tell you a short story. So back in August 2020, I went on a lockdown holiday with my family, and in Shrewsbury, or rather north of Shrewsbury. We stayed at the Premier Inn, and it was a lovely day, and we decided to walk about 5 miles to a nearby village to have some lunch. I got the Ordnance Survey map and I identified a path across a field. So the path was due to start there, and then we carry on our way to the nearby village. Just like to point out that Google has highlighted that this particular point is rural space, as if to suggest that the rest of this is not rural space. Anyway, the path that we'd identified on the Ordnance Survey map was due to start here, but there was a fence and a hedge blocking our way. And this annoyed me very much. I was prevented from walking the way I wanted to walk. Indeed, we all were, as a family. So I was very cross about this, and John Clare was very cross about barriers, about enclosure. Gilbert Slater, in his book The English Peasantry and the Enclosure of Common Fields, defines enclosure as meaning surrounding a piece of land with hedges, ditches or other barriers. And John Broad goes on to say that enclosure came in a variety of guises: in the reclamation of waste, the division of intercommon pasture, the privatisation of woods, and the elimination of common fields. And these are all processes that John Clare will have witnessed in his home village of Helpston. So this map is taken from Gilbert Slater's book. It's titled The Enclosure of Common Fields by Act of Parliament. On the UK Parliament website is buried this interesting fact: between 1604 and 1914, over 5,200 enclosure bills were enacted by Parliament, which related to just over a fifth of the total area of England, amounting to some 6.8 million acres. So 20% of England was enclosed legally. And there is Helpston. Helpston was subject to an Enclosure Act in 1809. John Clare was 16 years old in 1809. So he always associated his childhood with freedom. And indeed, Gilbert Slater, again, the enclosure of common fields is rightly termed the extinction of a village community. So John Clare wasn't just angry about the impact of enclosure on the natural environment that he had enjoyed, but he was also furious about the impact of enclosure on the cultural life of Helpston. Ways of life were simply stopped forever, and that of course was replicated across England because of enclosure. Just want to wind back a few hundred years, taking this quote from Guy Strobsell's wonderful yet depressing book, Who Owns England, published 2019. This quote gives some more context to land inequality in England. So William the Conqueror doled out the spoils of conquest to his barons, a surprising number of whose descendants remain major landowners today. So the descendants of these landowners, initial landowners, still own swathes of England thanks to a historical event that happened 1,000 years ago. And Guy Standing, in his book Plunder of the Commons, again 2019 it was published, said that actually the first statute of enclosure was really in 1235 with the Statute of Merton, which gave lords the right to take over forest commons on their estates. A second wave of enclosures came with the Tudors. The resultant enclosures led to widespread impoverishment in the countryside, and indeed, as a result of Acts of Parliament enclosing the land from 1604 onwards, the impoverishment of the countryside continued. So the Right to Roam website has this map that shows that we have 8%, we are able to access 8% of England, just 8%. So 92% of England is privately owned and not available to access. Again, this goes back to William the Conqueror and his barons. Nick Hayes, in his book that came out just a few months ago, The Trespasser's Companion, half of England is owned by less than 1% of the population. A third of Britain is still owned by the aristocracy. So again, going back to William the Conqueror. The Guy Standing again. About 2 million hectares of public land have been privatised since 1979, the year that Thatcher came into power and the year that John Major became MP for Huntingdon. So, the map from Gilbert Slater's book showing enclosure of common fields by Act of Parliament. Next to the Right to Roam map, we can see a massive reason why we have such little access to land in England. A huge impact, in particular, on the Midlands caused by enclosure. But again, to go back to the fact from the UK Parliament website, enclosure is responsible for the enclosure. Acts of Parliament are responsible for the enclosure of just 20% of England. There are other reasons why we have such little access to England. So, John Clare wrote several enclosure elegies, highly critical of enclosure and its impacts on the environment and cultural life of Helpston and beyond. So lines 19 to 20 in The Moors, John Clare writes that enclosure came and trampled on the grave of labour's rights and left the poor a slave. Absolutely to the point on the impact of enclosure. This type of direct language would not have looked out of place in a pamphlet by William Cobbett, a radical pamphleteer who John Clare would have been well aware of. William Cobbett was read by thousands of working class people across England in the 19th century and became an MP towards the end of his life. Radical political language in the Moors. Fence now meets fence in owner's little bounds, of field and meadow large as garden grounds, in little parcels, little minds to please, with men and flocks imprisoned ill at ease. So that last line in particular highlighting what an unnatural process enclosure is. Animals and men ill at ease with the enclosure of a natural environment. And again, reiterating that point, on the tree with ivy overhung, the hated sign by vulgar taste is hung, as though the very birds should learn to know when they go there they must no further go. So the absurdity of trying to hem in birds, and a wonderful image used to illustrate the effect of imprisonment caused by enclosure. So I just want to highlight this part of that stanza in particular, or that excerpt I should say. The hated sign by vulgar taste is hung. And we see these hated signs almost everywhere we go. And to prove that point, here's a photograph taken not far from where I live in Worcester. Private land, no public access or right of way. So this is in a local wood. And here's me looking at it from another point of view on the other side of the fence. And I noticed when I went for a run in the grounds of the University of Exeter, similar sign, University of Exeter, private property, no entry. And I couldn't resist looking at it from a different point of view. So, the Castle Morton Common Festival, just over 30 years ago, was a massive free festival in Worcestershire, a huge rave that attracted thousands of people, and a rave that caused a moral panic in the right-wing press and within the major government. To the point that this piece of legislation was created, the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994. Has a section titled Part 5, Public Order, Collective Trespass or Nuisance on Land. And under section 63, it famously defines what music is. And music includes sounds wholly or predominantly characterised by the omission of a succession of repetitive beats, which personally I find terrifying, the fact that the government can legislate for what constitutes art. But really, more to the point, I want to highlight this excerpt, or this part of the Act, which creates the offence of aggravated trespass. So this is essentially criminalising the disruption of legal activities such as hunting. So at the time, hunting legal. If you were to try and sabotage that hunt, then you'd be guilty under this legislation of aggravated trespass. And for that reason, I believe this is, well, one reason why I believe this legislation is a new Enclosure Act. So the Enclosure Acts would make trespass an offence, or did make trespass an offence. This is an extension of those Enclosure Acts, creating the offence of aggravated trespass. And the legislation was not just used for hunt saboteurs, it was about preventing access to the countryside for so-called hippies, New Age travellers. It made it more difficult for people to ramble in the countryside. This legislation is clamping down on particular cultural activities, not just raves. The Prodigy, a rave band famous in the 90s, was so aggrieved by the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act that they wrote a song about it called Their Law. And I want to emphasise that word there, and we were often told that the law is universal, will be treated equally under the law, but the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act was very much a law for those who own property, for those who were rich, and the law was being used to clamp down on alternative lifestyles. Again, go back to the Gilbert Slater quote about the extinction of village communities. The Criminal Justice and Public Order Act was suppressing cultural activity that the government just didn't like. So John Clare, as I said, wrote several enclosure elegies. one of which was called To a Fallen Elm. And he says, to cheat plain honesty by force of might, thus came enclosure. So enclosure was about the powerful asserting their right to ownership of the land at the expense of the common person, like John Clare. And again goes on to expand upon that point that the powerful are gaining at the expense of the weak, who glut their vile unsatiated maws, and freedom's birthright from the weak devours. Helpston. The name of the village where Clare grew up, was born and grew up. Accursed wealth, O bound in human laws, of every evil thou remainest the cause. So again, making that point that enclosure was about enhancing the wealth and the power of the rich elite. And their law, the main lyric in that song, Ephraim and their law. And essentially that is what John Clare said in his enclosure elegies. How dare they do this to me and the people in my village and beyond? This law is to protect the interests of a tiny section of society at the expense of the majority, who for hundreds of years had access to the land and were able to provide for themselves. So Jason Hickel, an economist, said capitalism is defined by enclosure and artificial scarcity. The origins of capitalism lie in a systematic effort by elites to restrict people's access to commons and independent subsistence in order to render them reliant on wage labour for survival. He goes on to say, the result is a system that left to itself automatically generates inequality and ecological breakdown. And this makes enclosure absolutely current to the predicament that we're in right now. But if we want to protest about enclosure and its impact on our access to the natural environment and the impact of capitalism on our natural environment, just experienced record temperatures in this country, we're going to have a problem because of legislation that's passed a few weeks ago, which you could argue is also an extension of the Enclosure Act. The Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022, again a section on public order, imposing conditions on public processions. A senior police officer can intervene with a public procession if they believe that there may be serious disruption to the life of the community, which I find highly ironic because that is a wonderfully succinct way of describing the impact of enclosure, serious disruption to the life of the community. But also, under this legislation, a senior police officer can get themselves involved if they are concerned about the noise that will be generated because of the protest. So that's where we're at now. If we want to protest about what's happening, then if it's too noisy, we are likely to be arrested for that. So how are we going to get our views across? Are we going to write songs like The Prodigy? Are we going to make them quiet enough for the authorities to find acceptable? Are we going to write poems like John Clare did? What have we got left to protest against enclosure, ecological breakdown? Only a few days ago, it was reported, a UN report was reported in the press, and the report concluded that a market-based focus on short-term profits and economic growth means the wider benefits of nature have been ignored. And enclosure was all about profit at the expense of nature and the people who had lived in a natural environment and worked for themselves. The review, the UN review or report highlights 4 general perspectives that should be taken into account. And I'm just going to highlight one. Living in nature, which refers to people's right to a sense of place and identity. And when I read that, I immediately thought of John Clare, because throughout his hundreds and hundreds of poems, he placed himself in the middle of nature, and nature was part of him. And when Helpston was enclosed, a part of him was removed. He was absolutely embedded in nature. E.P. Thompson, famous in particular for writing The Making of the English Working Class, wrote that Clare may be described without hindsight as a poet of ecological protest. He was not writing about man here and nature there, but lamenting a threatened equilibrium in which both were involved. So John Clare is absolutely relevant to us today. And Jonathan Bate goes on to say, no one has written so powerfully of his bond with his native place, of the land and the landscape, of the rupture of environmental change. In a time of ecological crisis, Clare is being reclaimed as a secular prophet. So the Right to Rome website has this question: how can we be expected to care about the environment when for so long we've been disconnected from it? So Clare is a way in. He can make us reappreciate our connection with the land. We need that connection with the land that we've been excluded from if we are to look after it properly. Thank you.